So in this video we're going to talk about what Wittgenstein thinks is the right way to think about language. And the very first thing to say is that Wittgenstein doesn't think of himself as giving a different theory or kind of different picture in the same way as you might have thought like St. Augustine is giving a picture of language, or Frege is giving a theory, or Russell's giving a theory. Because in every way we've thought about it so far, what people have been trying to do is they've been, asking something like, well, what is meaning, or what is the meaning of a particular kind of word? And they've been trying to find out some sort of general feature that all words of that kind share, or all uses of words like that share. That's what we might mean by sort of like giving a theory of language, or a theory of the meaning of a word, or a theory of meaning in general, to find some sort of set of properties that fit all the uses or fit all the instances of a kind of name or a kind of use of language or something like that. Wittgenstein is not going to give a theory like that. In fact, he thinks a theory like that is impossible. He thinks that there are so many different kinds of things we do with language, it's just not possible to give a unified theory of all of them. To kind of warm up to what he has in mind, he has this really nice example of games. And he says that if you think about the concept of a game, what you'll see is that there's not really one thing that it is to be a game. There's no one set of features that all games share. Rather, the class of games, the set of games, just picks out a bunch of different things that are related by what he calls a family resemblance. So for instance, if we look at the set of games, we see that some of them are played with boards, some games are board games, but most of them aren't. Some games are played in a court, like tennis or basketball, but again, lots of games are not. Some games, the object is to win, but other games, there are games where the object is not to win. Maybe it's just to not. Maybe, every playing of the game inevitably. Think about Tetris, for instance. Every game of you lose every single game of Tetris you play. So the object is not necessarily to win, but it's to get the highest possible score. There are obviously a range of other different things that you can have in mind that you might think games are trying to do, or might define games. But Wittgenstein's claim is that no matter what kind of property you find, there are always going to be some counterexamples. There are always going to be some games which lack that. There's just no unifying property that all games have. So if there's nothing that all games share, the obvious question is, well, what makes them all games? Why is the set of games this class of things and not something else? You would have thought it was because they all share some sort of feature. And Wittgenstein says, no, that's not the reason they're all called games. The reason they're all called games is because they share what's called a family resemblance. So here the idea is that anything that's a game is just similar enough to other things that are called games to count as being a game itself. So the reason why, maybe snakes and ladders and basketball are both games, even though they're very different from each other, is that they're similar to other things that we already count as games. Now, obviously those two examples are very different from each other, so maybe there would be a sort of chain in resemblance before we got to each other. But for instance, maybe snakes and ladders is sort of similar to hopscotch. Maybe hopscotch is it's certainly more similar to basketball than snakes and ladders is. So maybe there are examples in the middle, snakes and ladders are similar to, and that basketball is similar to. That's why they sort of both count as being games. So the big idea is that things get to count as being games not because they all share some feature, but rather they're similar enough to other things that are already counted as games. And that's what it means for there to be a family resemblance between a set of objects. There's a family resemblance between a set of objects not when they share some feature necessarily, but rather when there's just a bunch of different kind of similarities between them that kind of seem to unify them, or they're all sort of closer to some things that are called games than non-games. So that's the example. That's what it means to talk about family resemblances, and that's what it means in the case of games. So Wittgenstein gives this example of games. The point of it is to introduce us to this idea of a family resemblance, to give us a different kind of case of things where there's just no property that all of the things share, rather they're unified by a family resemblance. And the reason why Wittgenstein is interested in this example is because he thinks exactly the same goes for using language as well. There is no one thing that all uses of language share, Wittgenstein thinks. Rather, just as there is a family resemblance between different things that are games, so lots of different things count as being games, even though some of them are very different from each other. We saw Snakes and Ladders is very different from basketball, but they're both games. Wittgenstein thinks the same thing happens with language as well. There are lots of different things that we do with language, and there's no one thing in virtue of which they all count as meaning something. Rather, to mean something is just a family resemblance of various different things you can do with language. And he asks you to think about all the different things you can do with language. You can give an order. You can report that an event happened. You can guess a riddle. You can tell a joke. What do all of these things share? Like, for instance, think about the Augustinian picture. Is there one thought in mind that we're always sharing in all these examples? Not obviously. So the alternative is to think, well, maybe instead what we've got is a case of a family resemblance. There's no one property they all share. Rather, there's lots of different things we can do with language, some of them more or less like other ones. So that's to explain why he doesn't think there's a theory of language in the way that Frege thought there was a theory of language, or Russell, or Mill, or any of these people we've thought before. Wittgenstein is rejecting that whole idea, and he's trying to replace it with this idea of there being a family resemblance between different uses of language. But the one thing he does think is really important, and that maybe does underlie all uses of language, maybe it's not enough by itself to just count as explaining meaning or something like that. But one thing that does seem to be central is that when we use language, the point of using language is not to communicate thoughts or something like that. The point of language is to do something. So think about our examples. The point when you tell a riddle, the point of telling a riddle is not to necessarily communicate some thought. It's to do something. And it just happens that the way to do that thing is by using a piece of language. Consider telling a joke as well. Telling a joke is not necessarily communicating a thought. A different take on what's going on there, Wittgenstein suggests, is really the point of using language when telling a joke is not to communicate a thought, it's just to do something, namely telling a joke. And Wittgenstein is thinking that there are just lots of different things that we can try to do using language, like giving orders or reporting events or, getting shopkeepers to give us things or getting our assistants to fetch us slabs and things like that. There are lots of just individual, particular kinds of usages for language, and there's nothing that all of them share. There's no feature that they all have in common. And each of these individual practices is something that Wittgenstein calls a language game. So, for instance, the example of the shopkeeper, the practice of giving him a note and getting something in return, that's a language game. The example of the assistant and the builder, that's a language game. Maybe the practice of telling jokes or telling riddles, that's another different kind of language game. And his view seems to be that really what language is just a series of these individual language games. It's just a series of these different, similar but different uses. And we can just think of language in general as just the collection of these kind of different practices. To use language is just to be inducted into a big long list of language games. So summing up, the big idea here is that there are just lots of different things we can do with language, Wittgenstein thinks. And there's no one thing that they all have in common. And it's supposed to be, I think, precisely parallel to the case of games. There's no one thing that a game is, there are just lots of different ways to be a game. What unites them is this notion of a family resemblance. And Wittgenstein's saying the same thing goes for language. There are lots of different things that you can do with language. There's no one thing they all share in common. Rather, what a language is just a collection of these practices which are related through a family resemblance.